Recent flurry of diplomatic activity by North Korea with its neighbors has fueled hopes of getting North Korea back to the negotiating table for the first time in more than 5 years.
Right, so for more on the possibility of that happening, we are joined live in the studio by our Hwang Sung-hee. Sung-hee, let's start with North Korea and Japan mending ties. Now, what does this mean for trilateral cooperation between South Korea, U.S., and Japan in its dealings against North Korea?
Well, for the most part, Japan's individual dialogue with North Korea centers on the issue of Japanese citizens abducted by the North. But Japan has promised to lift its individual sanctions on the North once the reinvestigation into the abduction issue begins. But rather than affecting Tokyo's trilateral alliance with Seoul and Washington, many say this will reduce Pyongyang's dependence on Beijing. But because Japan has been very transparent about its interactions with North Korea leading up to its agreement, experts say from now on it's important that Tokyo maintains behind-the-scenes consultations with Seoul and Washington.
Now, Sung-hee, we know that Chinese President Xi Jinping is due for a state visit to South Korea in the coming months, and North Korea, of course, will be at the top of their discussions between Chinese President and President Park Geun-hye. Should and will South Korea ask China to do more to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table?
Well, China certainly has a huge influence on Pyongyang as its biggest economic benefactor. 90% of North Korea's trade was with China last year. But when I asked that very question to Joel Witt, former U.S. official and North Korea expert at Johns Hopkins University, in my recent interview with him, he said Beijing's role doesn't stretch as far as we think. Let's take a look.
So I think there are limits to how far China will go. And I think we need to take it upon ourselves to figure out how to solve this problem. We can't rely on China.
Now, this means South Korea and the United States should take a more proactive role by holding their own talks with North Korea. They should keep China informed, but not act as the middleman anymore. We also have to keep an eye on North Korea's blossoming ties with Russia. Now, Russia has been moving rapidly to cozy up with North Korea in response to the West's sanctions stemming from the Ukraine crisis. And for Pyongyang, the relationship means it can gain leverage over its dependence on China. Experts say this opens up another chance for dialogue.
Russia and North Korea's mending ties are an appropriate step toward the resumption of dialogue, because Moscow could convince Pyongyang to return to the six-party talks.
Well, the chief nuclear envoys of South Korea and the U.S., last week they met in Washington. We were talking about changes. Are they showing any change in their joint stance, Sung-hee?
Not really, Daniel. Seoul and Washington just reaffirmed their joint stances that six-party talks will not happen unless North Korea takes practical steps for denuclearization, which would start with the freezing of its nuclear development program. Now, some experts are critical that the two countries are sort of drifting away from dialogue efforts and focusing entirely on beefing up their defenses against North Korea.
Well, even if the talks resume, there are more questions left to be answered. The key question is, will the six-party framework, as it is currently, be effective in denuclearizing the Hermit Kingdom?
Well, experts do remain divided on whether the six-party talks format has passed its expiry date. In my recent interview with him, Victor Cha of the Center for Strategic and International Studies said that the six-party framework is still the most valid form to tackle North Korea's nuclear ambitions, while Professor Joel Witt said a new form of dialogue could be considered.
But the six-party format is also important because it ensures that whatever agreements are made between the U.S. and North Korea are reaffirmed in the six-party context to ensure that, in particular, the North Koreans comply with the agreement.
So much time has passed since we've had a real dialogue with North Korea that it may be worthwhile, rather than clinging to the past, that we do a total review of where we are, where we're going, and how do we avoid the consequences of a North Korea with a growing stockpile of nuclear weapons.
But of course, most experts do agree that maintaining some sort of communication with North Korea is better than having no communication at all.
Sure. I mean, keeping North Korea engaged, definitely not an easy task without giving them the impression that they are being awarded for bad behavior. So definitely not an easy task there. All right, Sung-hee, thank you so much for that report.
My pleasure.